Yeah, so my name's Bart. I moved from the Netherlands to Montreal a couple of years ago for Shopify. I moved there in October. That's straight when the winter starts to happen. Winters in Montreal are pretty harsh, not as harsh as last Sunday's Game of Thrones episode, fortunately. But in the office in the winter and in summer, been working on a lot of payments-related stuff at Shopify. That included maintaining the active merchant library that we co-maintain with our friends from Spreetly, stuff like Google Pay, and last year I mostly started focusing on expanding our own payment gateway, Shopify Payments, internationally. So let's back up a bit. And what is Shopify again? So Shopify is a commerce platform. People can sell online or in person. And as of last year, the counter is at 800,000 merchants worldwide in basically every country. But that is just Shopify itself. Shopify Payments is not available worldwide yet, sadly. To recap real quickly is in 2013, people had an idea during one of our internal hackathons, which was like, why don't we build our own payments offering? Because people call our support often, having trouble setting up a third-party gateway. Sometimes the instructions are not clear, or the integration behaves a little bit unexpectedly, and we figured if we build something ourselves, we can we have complete control over the user experience and build a really good solution for our merchants, which are our clients, and we're obsessed with giving them the best experience possible. So we initially launched in North America, then slowly started expanding to UK, Australia. And if you kind of see a trend here that basically up until last year, it was all English-speaking countries where people mostly use credit cards. And by offering Shopify Payments, merchants also get access to some exclusive features, including Capital, which is our merchant cash advance product, and Shopify Pay, which is our own accelerated checkout solution alongside Apple Pay and Google Pay. So last year, we started expanding into Hong Kong, Japan, Spain, and Germany. And I'll be talking mostly about those. So again, you can see our core markets here are mostly English-speaking, but the rest of the world is an important market for us that we also want to offer our own payment gateway with all the extra features that it brings. So last year, there was a company-wide effort basically kicking off our global expansion, and among other things, that also meant translating our admin into 6 different languages. Before that, it was just all in English, and not even with extracted strings, just like straight hard-coded English in the code. That was a massive effort, but that's not the subject of this talk. Like I said, we'll be mostly focusing on our international payments expansion. Before we started, though, the saying goes that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So we started talking to people who were involved in previous launches, which mostly happened at a cadence of one a year. And we kind of looking back at project retrospectives, we figured that every country launch is a unique project. But since we didn't do it often and people involved were different every time, there were mistakes made, and there was a little chance to learn from those mistakes because you only do it once a year. It was not a very repeatable process. So we talked to a lot of people at the end of 2017, and we kind of boiled down a couple of lessons learned. And what was very common complaint among basically all the departments involved was they either get looped in way too early and then they fiddled their thumbs, or more often they get in looped too late because people are fiddling their thumbs and hey, I need this yesterday. And some stuff like drawing up legal contracts or setting up an entity in a country don't happen in overnight. For example, setting up a company or like even opening a bank account after you've set up your company in some countries can take months. I think for our Hong Kong bank account, it took over half a year to get a bank account set up, which meant that, yes, we could start accepting payments, but we actually did not see it enter into our bank accounts, which we then, of course, had to find a solution for because our financial reconciliation platform was not really built for that scenario. Another problem was that communication was often ad hoc. People like talks directly to each other, but sometimes if one team says to another, like, hey, I'm going to be late with this, it might also be pertinent to another team. So we made sure that that moving forward with new country launches, we will keep everything in one Slack channel, whether that's marketing, whether that's development or legal. Make sure that the most relevant, that like whatever might be of impact to another team is shared in that channel so that people can then decide for themselves, is it relevant for me or not? And like I said already, different teams, they all got to make their own mistakes, but there was also a common thread throughout these. So we needed to like also kind of like create a body of knowledge, being like, what does a country launch involve? Because there's like 10 different departments all over the company involved. We need to make sure that we all know what we're doing and what we can expect from each other. So we started writing a playbook. The playbook started off with a brief, like, what do we expect from marketing? What do we expect from legal? What is your role in all of this? Why are you here? That includes, of course, your responsibilities as part of this project. A very clear list of deliverables and dependencies. Again, making sure that everything is crystal clear. And roughly the timelines involved. Legal works on a very different cadence than a development team. A development team can basically start whenever and immediately start churning out code, and then within a couple of weeks have something that works. Legal might be complicated in like a whole bunch of other projects and might not have that same agility with their current workload. Very important during this process is that we sat down with one representative, so to say, of each of these departments and wrote with them their chapters of the playbook. This was not top-down driven. We wanted to have them committed to their timelines, to their responsibilities, so that if anything were to like go less optimal, that it was like, hey, we talked about this. Like, where did this go wrong? Were you too optimistic? Is there something else going on? But one delay might delay other teams and kind of like have a ripple effect on the entire project. This was because of all the moving parts involved, and we were, Richard and I, we were both new to launching a country ourselves. This was very important for us to just get clear and knew what we were getting ourselves into. But at the same time, our end goal with the playbook is that maybe even other teams than the Shopify payments team could do a country launch. We had a team dedicated to the international expansion that kicked off last year. And while they've been working on other stuff, like making sure that address autocomplete works worldwide and not just for North American markets, maybe they want to launch our payments offering in another country, while for our own roadmap, that country was not as prioritized. So now that we've written this all down, what does our country launch process actually look like? So first we start off with research. And I mean, there's 175 countries. We have to like start somewhere. Is this country that we're looking at right now the right market to launch in? How much merchants do we have there? What does the existing payment offering look like for merchants? Is that great or maybe not so great? What other things do we need to make sure that we have a product that makes sense in this market? Do people speak English, or do we need to also loop in the international team and make sure that we have our admin translated in that language and our help documentation? Are there local payment methods? I'm from the Netherlands, for example. 55% of online transactions use a bank-based payment system called iDeal. Only 12% of online transactions use credit cards. And in stores, people use debit cards all the time. Credit cards are not often accepted. If we were to launch Shopify Payments with only credit cards, people would be like, why? Why even bother? I'm not going to switch. Taxes are also an important thing to get right. If you've entered the European market and you've sent invoices to your customers, anybody? Few hands. So this is very interesting way of charging VAT on invoices, where like if you have a European entity in one country, say Ireland, and you charge your German customer, it's very common to put 0% VAT on there and a little byline that says that the recipient is responsible for correctly charging the VAT on the invoice. The Irish VAT is 23%, the German VAT is 19%, and of course nobody's happy to be overcharged VAT on their invoices, but also the procedure for reclaiming that VAT as a business expense in Europe, if it's not zero rated, is very complicated and painful. And we also have a lot of like smaller merchants. They might not even make that threshold amount. So make sure that you do what is expected in that country when it comes to stressful things like taxes. And since Shopify Payments is built on Stripe, we also of course have to talk to them, make sure that they are ready to support expanding our offering into a target market. Then we get into the prerequisites phase, which is basically anything that we figured out should be done before we actually kick off the development. So this is legal agreements. If needed, found a legal entity, make sure that we have a bank account there. What do we actually want to charge our merchants in terms of like pricing for credit cards and for local payment methods, if applicable? Like looking at the past, this sounds very waterfall-y, like we can't move forward until we have this. But we learned from the past that if we move forward while this is not fully into place, it comes to bite us in the rear, because either it holds up launching, or we actually have to go back and redo a few things because we were building on the wrong assumptions, because these important parts were not set in stone yet. Then we get to the part that I like most, which is just coding. You put on your headphones and you get cracking. This can take anywhere between a couple of weeks to a couple of months, depending on what is needed in the country, whether that support needs local payment methods, and if there are any other specific requirements that I'll talk about a little bit later. To give you an idea of what we consider a simple launch, which is credit cards only, no translations, no additional requirements. We launched Hong Kong, at least the build phase for Hong Kong was 5 to 6 weeks. The one that we launched last was Spain at the end of last year, and we did that in 3. So we also just got a lot better at it, but also because we invested in making this process easier, which I'll also talk about later. And then we get to deployment. We've learned that it's good to reach out to our partner network or merchants that we somehow have a connection with and invite them onto a beta, have them go through the sign-up, have them process some payments, see if everything, this is of course after we've tested internally, but you never know how your work is going to be used in the wild, so it's always good to check your assumptions, see if it actually works as expected, and make sure that your support staff knows what's up. Somebody in Canada doesn't know how local payment methods across the world work. So they need training. And then we launch, we monitor, and we fix what's needed, and then we move on to the next project. So I'll be talking a little bit about our Japan and Germany launches, which were the most technically interesting. It's going to be a bit of a story format. I'll talk you through it as we experienced it. So after Hong Kong came Japan. As you can kind of imagine, that Japan is quite different than our core markets where people mostly speak English. Oh. While we were doing our research phase, we pretty soon discovered that our onboarding form required some work. Because a requirement was that we would not only ask for people's first name, last name, business address, etc., but do that also in katakana and in kanji script. So here's an excerpt of our onboarding form. where we ask people to fill out the statement descriptor that shows up on their customer billing statements, also in the 2 different Japanese scripts. So this required a bit of a rethink of like, how do we approach this? And just another small fact that I like to point out is the devil is in the details on this sign-up form. If you see the example that we show to merchants to give them an idea what this data is used for, it asks for 10 yen and 35 yen and 120 yen. This used to be hard-coded amounts, and we just like stick a currency symbol in front of it. But while we're building this, it's like, wait a second, 120 yen is like a couple of cents, US cents. It doesn't really make sense. So, but it does, all these little things can give merchants in these countries the impression that you don't really understand their market, and that might lead to a loss of trust. But back to the sign-up form itself. So we kind of like looked at how our current code worked, and we were not really happy that there was a few instances where like, if account country is something like this. So we kind of like set out a principle to avoid that if possible. We already had some configuration in place to extract this kind of logic and make it more declarative instead of procedural. But we wanted to do that for more than just, say, the name of the VAT in a country. So we also wanted to do that for our modeling. So here's an excerpt of how our configuration file looks like. We store these in YAML files, we write our code in Ruby on Rails, and we have a gem called frozen record, which allows us to work with these YAML files as if they're actual rows from the database, so we can like do a where or like other filtering very easily. So what we did for Japan was we created some configuration for additional attribute models, and because we didn't want super wide tables where for non-Japanese countries the columns would be empty, we instead created new tables for the descriptor and for the legal entity with the katakana and kanji versions. Then in the code, on the account model, we can get the configuration. We do that by the configuration key, which is Shopify Payments JP for Japan. And then our validations kind of look like this. We just ask the configuration, hey, for this country, do we need the business tax ID for this business type? Or does this additional model need to be there? And if it is there, is it also valid? This worked out pretty well. Another fun challenge for Japan was Japan's banking system itself. Another important part of this onboarding form is, of course, the bank account. People want to get paid after they made sales. The banking system over there does use bank and branch codes, but unlike, say, in Canada or the US, there are no checks that you can redirect people to, being like, hey, you know, find these numbers on your check and enter them here so we can pay you. Instead, most Japanese e-commerce related websites have something like this. Oh, is it starting? No. Where people fill out their bank name and then their branch name. And then on the back end, we actually find the bank and branch code and send that off to Stripe for payouts. How do you think we get our hands on this data from the Japanese banks? Any takers? Oh, almost. We get like, every quarter, they send us a CD through snail mail to our Tokyo co-working space with like a 30 megabyte CSV. And we have a bunch of scripts set up that parse that, create a smaller version of that, which is like just relevant for our lookup here, so that we could build this feature. Initially, and this is just a cultural gap, this search function was a little simple. It just worked on a simple regex, which was a little bit too strict. When we launched, and of course with the time zone differences involved, we launched at the end of our working day, which meant that Japan's next working day hadn't quite started yet. We had dinner, we went to sleep, and the next morning we woke up and our Japanese support was basically saying, it's all completely broken. Oops. So we had to scramble a bit. we used Splunk, and we quickly built a Splunk dashboard to figure out what was going on and where, and just to start on the biggest issue, which seemed to be the banking form, which was exactly the case. And we built out this dashboard a little bit more so we could see which shops tried to sign up, and if they were non-successful, they would end up in the left column, and all of the shops, successful or not, would end up in the right column, and then we could kind of dig down in the Stripe errors and our internal validation errors. This dashboard has become crucial for every country launch since, to kind of keep a finger on the pulse to see if the country, if the sign-up process is going smoothly or people are having a lot of problems. And this particular error stuck out at the time as a sore thumb. It was way up there in that list by far. And we even saw that in the other two tabs that some merchants had tried 10, 20, 30 times to sign up, and they were not successful. So we went back to drawing board. We could use Splunk to figure out what they were actually inputting and how that did or did not match to our data through our simple regex. We rebuilt the search functionality using a fuzzy string matching algorithm. We deployed it, and I stayed up late to be in touch with our support staff, being hey, can you give this a try? Does this at least work a little bit better? Because we got some initial promising feedback. I went to sleep, and the next morning I looked at the dashboard again. I was yes, there's still some things to iron out, but at least people are having a somewhat easier time signing up. And we also realized that there's a cultural gap. We had someone on the team who had an interest in Japanese culture, but was not from Japan itself. And with the time zones, we also got thinking, should we have just gone to Japan and just be there with the support team, have that direct feedback loop, so we can iterate much faster instead of deploying something and then hoping for the best the next morning that it would actually work as hoped. Interesting point, for some reason, Japanese merchants keep fields blank, because all the other errors are just you did not fill in this mandatory field. I have no idea why, to be honest. Going on to our next interesting launch, Germany. So I'm from the Netherlands, and the Germans are our eastern neighbors, but even for us, even for me, they're quite different. For example, Germans love carrying cash, and just like in Mexico, they don't pay with their cards in the supermarket, even if they just tell you to go to the ATM around the corner and then come back carrying cash. On average, a German customer carries around 100 euros, which I think is a lot. I think in the Netherlands I never really carried more than 50, and that was a lot for me. But the same thing goes for online payments. They don't use credit cards all that much, so we couldn't just launch there with our credit card offering. So we instead had to go and build a local payment method into Shopify Payments, and this was a first. Shopify Payments has always been a credit card gateway. And I mentioned Active Merchant before. Active Merchant kind of only knows direct credit card gateways where people fill out their PAN on the checkout, and offsites. Nothing in between. And given that over the last 5 years we had built on Shopify Payments with the assumption it was always a direct credit card gateway. So how do you fit that on there? Well, in this case, even though we said that we don't really want to have conditionals in there, for this we had to do if gateway Shopify Payments, then do this, otherwise just treat it as a regular credit card gateway. Fortunately, I expect that this will be the only case ever that we need to do something like this. If you were here last year, you might have seen this talk by John Duff about our PCI infrastructure. That still holds true about how we process credit cards, but for local payment methods, we had to do something differently. We didn't want to keep it all in our main monolith, the Shopify core application as we call it, because we also want to give other applications the possibility to use these local payment methods. Or not even local payment methods as you might think of it, but we also do ACH for billing and for capital. They both have their own ACH code. Why not centralize this, make our lives easier? So we build a new service, very imaginatively called Payment Service, to make this work. This was quite the investment that started like long before we actually started thinking about doing the German country launch. But it was an important part of our longer strategic roadmap. The first German payment method that we launched with is called Sofort. Well, for those of you who don't speak German, and you might look it up on Google Translate, it kind of means immediately, instantly, at once. That's also how merchants think it works and how buyers think it works. How it actually works is an asynchronous payment method where a payment may be pending up to 14 days. Most of the time it is not, but it's like that long tail of like the last 10% or so of payments that stay pending for a longer period of time. And then they may actually even fail. German merchants were a little bit amazed by the fact that we told them, like, hey, this person just paid through Sofort, but the payment is still pending, and we recommend you don't ship the order just yet. They're like, what is this? Are you Canadians not understanding how our German payment merchants work? It's actually kind of like the other way around, but try telling that to your customers. We do think, however, that that this is up to the merchant to decide for themselves if they want to take the gamble that the payment eventually clears or not. And we just show them, like, can you expect this to show up in your next payout, yes or no? But that was definitely some hard conversations on, like, how do we explain this, that, like, it isn't working as you think it does. And the other one that we launched with, also very popular in Germany, is Klarna Pay Later. Also called Klarna Invoicing, because in German it's called Klarna Rechnung. Interestingly here is that we had a new problem, is that we want to collect, we want to have an effortless onboarding onto Shopify payments, so we don't ask for more than we strictly need. But for Klarna Pay Later, we needed to ask a little bit more information, like what kind of merchant categories is the business in. For Klarna, we could just, for the existing merchants, we could go back and show them a banner in the admin saying, like, hey, if you want to activate Klarna, you need to fill out this. But we realized that this would not be scalable in the long term. We had to rebuild our admin in GraphQL anyway, because we are also rebuilding our admin in React on top of the same GraphQL APIs that we're offering to our partners. So this was a good chance to rethink this approach. And I see I need to start hurrying. Our current form structure is very simple. We have some views divided by country. If there is a country-specific view for that piece of information, we show that one. Otherwise, we fall back to the generic one. But this doesn't really work for the case like, what if this merchant wants to activate this new payment method? Or what if we need to go back for regulatory reasons and ask more information than we ever collected? So since we had a greenfields opportunity here, we wanted to make it entirely dynamic. Since we were such a big fan of configuring over coding for our other parts of our country-specific code, we wanted to apply the same logic to our forms. So the short of it is that the server generates a JSON schema that is consumed by React. React then renders that schema. There are various nodes in there. Some of them are just a form. Some of them express some kind of conditional. For example, if the business type is a corporation, then we ask for a VAT ID. But if it's a sole proprietor, then we don't need to ask for that VAT ID, or at least make it an optional field. Then that generates also a GraphQL mutation that is then being sent off to the backend. This is super interesting stuff, which is like a talk in its own. My coworkers who are working on this are planning to give a talk about that at possibly a React or a Rails conference. So hopefully it is coming soon to a conference near you. But that will solve a lot of our problems. More local payment methods, cross-border local payment methods, new regulatory requirements in the US like FinCEN. Sure, we'll just generate what's missing and then send it off to the front end, and the merchant can fill that out. Easy peasy. So looking back on these country launches, was it all worth it, all this effort, all this work? Well, we think so. All the merchants that I've talked to gather feedback or ask them to onboard onto our beta program are super happy that they now get access to like a whole range of new features that have been not accessible to them because they were just based out of the wrong country. They see what's available in the US and they want all of that as well. Like you often hear literally like, it's nice to see that Shopify is finally giving our country some attention. We also had a gut feeling that launching Shopify payments in countries would help our adoption of Shopify as a whole. We dove deep on the data, and that was confirmed. But we also saw that because everything is integrated into one admin for the merchants, merchants were more productive. They started doing more sales, and they were less likely to churn off the platform because they were successful on the platform. And our business model is based on the fact that our merchant success is our success. So that's win-win for all involved. Also, though, we're far from done. I bought one of those scratch maps to hang in our pod. And I'd like to joke that like we're not done until we've scratched off every country. This is only part of the features that are exclusive to Shopify and Shopify payments. Merchants now have online payments in these countries, but they don't have retail payments yet. So they ask like, cool, with Shopify payments, when is the card reader coming that is like already available in the US? Coming, but not ready just yet. So in conclusion, good preparation is half the work, or even more so. We can like develop and launch really quickly if we've done our homework beforehand. Local knowledge is key. If ideally you want somebody who has lived there for multiple years, grown up there, to help you answer any kind of question that you might have, to go through the onboarding or using the product, because they are uniquely suited to tell you what will work and what won't work. Because no matter how hard you try, you will probably miss a lot of nuances. And while it's very tempting to just like launch as many markets as you can real quickly, it can get very hairy. So sometimes you have to take a step back and make sure that you don't take on a bunch of technical debt that will then actually slow down your country launch process, but that you keep it easy for your engineering team as well. That was it. Thanks. You can find me on Twitter or on LinkedIn.